digital civil war is playing out.
Yeah.
Maybe we start with Pavel, Durov, and Telegram.
The thing that really distinguished Telegram from all the other major social media platforms is that Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, they're actively, you could say, collaborating with government to monitor, track, and ultimately censor what the government decides is misinformation or disinformation. Telegram never did that.
Ashley Rindsberg is an investigative journalist, a commentator, and author of The Grey Lady Winked. He also is the author of How the Regime Captured Wikipedia. Why is this such a big deal, this Zuckerberg letter?
I think it's a big deal because it changes reality, and they know that.
How is it that the New York Times maintain their reputation?
They actually just cited the Nazi publication as the source.
You have done a big investigation into it, and I want to know how Wikipedia really works.
So Wikimedia Foundation, you sometimes you see these kind of banners on Wikipedia asking for money. In reality, today, Wikimedia Foundation has $400 million. What are they doing with all that money? But here we have one guy defining for the whole world what's considered reliable and unreliable in the media. What this also means is that, and this is how Wikipedia actually works.
Ashley, thank you so much for coming to speak with me. Before we get into it, and there's a lot to get into, I wondered, to an audience who might not be familiar with you, could give us a little bit of your journey, of course, your famous book about the New York Times, and now you are an outspoken journalist going against the regime, but maybe tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. So I sort of set out on a kind of unusual path. I went to a good university in New York and went to work in San Francisco, actually for the guys who do the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive. It's kind of my first foray into this saving and investigating things and making sure things are not lost. And I kind of grew bored of San Francisco, and I got a job on a sailing yacht, ended up in Israel. And it was there, I was just kind of wandering around, and I found this book about World War II by William Shirer, where he mentioned in a footnote that when the hostilities of World War II broke out in 1939, the New York Times ran a lead story saying that Poland had invaded Germany. And I was like, excuse me? The New York Times said that? So I actually went and investigated that. It turned out it was true. They cited a Nazi publication to back it up. And that actually was a German, what we would call today, disinformation campaign. It was propaganda. They tricked the world into believing that Polish guerrillas had invaded a German radio station. It wasn't true, but the New York Times ran with it. And the most surprising thing is that they actually just cited the Nazi publication as the source. That was the only source in the whole article. So that gave me this idea to sort of ask how many times the New York Times had made that kind of error and why. And that set me off on this journey of writing this book for a year, where I sort of tracked these major historical incidences. The criteria was that they had to have sort of influenced history in some way, not just kind of random political stuff or bias. And that became The Grey Lady Winked, the book that I launched in 2021. Initially, when I went out to publish it, I got just no's across the board. I mean, I wrote the book probably 16, 17 years ago, and people just flat out told me, they're like, we're not going to oppose the New York Times. The most powerful instrument in publishing is the New York Times bestseller list, which is considered an editorial property. It's not about the numbers. They don't publish data. They make an editorial decision of who's on and not on the list. And agents and publishers, probably rightly so, we're not going to take that risk.
Yeah.
So 2021 rolls around, and there's all this stuff going on at the New York Times. Leaking his tax returns, Trump's tax returns, the Barry Weiss thing where she sort of resigns, saying she just can't work in an environment like that. And I was like, okay, this is the moment. So took the leap. I put the book out, and it obviously struck a chord.
Well, I'd love to come back to the New York Times. It's not just them shilling for Nazi Germany. Sorry, when I say the New York Times, your book and the New York Times,
Yeah.
not just shilling for Nazi Germany. There was also the case that they were doing so for Stalin, for Castro, and you go into that.
Yeah.
Let's come back to that. But what you're describing is seemingly what's going on today. It's not just the New York Times, but there's sort of legacy media, mainstream media, the regime, and then their parroting of disinformation. And then suddenly have moments like we've had this past week with Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta, and of course Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, is publishing this open letter to Jim Jordan, stating that he regrets being pressured by the Biden-Harris administration into censoring information on COVID, as well as on a Hunter Biden laptop story and other things. And then we also have, at the same time, Pavel Durov, who's just been detained in Paris at the Le Bourget airport, the CEO and founder of Telegram. So it seems to me that the digital civil war, which our mutual friend Balaji Srinivasan is playing out.
Yeah.
Maybe we start with Pavel Durov and Telegram. What's your analysis? What do you make of this?
To me, this is incredibly clear cut. The thing that really distinguished Telegram from all the other major social media platforms is that they just refuse to play ball on disinformation. What that means is that Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, pretty much you name it, they are, as we've seen with the Zuckerberg thing, they are actively cooperating, you could say collaborating with government to monitor, track, and ultimately censor what the government decides is misinformation or disinformation. Telegram never did that. And I think there's two issues there. One is that there could be some ideological thing with Pavel to say, I'm drawing a line. We can report child abuse. We can report drug trafficking. We can report things that are outright crimes. And they had processes for doing that on the platform.
Right.
The one thing, and this is going according to the EU Disinfo Lab, it's sort of an EU connected independent NGO. The one thing that they refused to report on, to comply with, was the disinformation requests. And of course, the disinformation is the biggest issue of the day for a lot of
so the Telegram did comply on trying to deal with these seriously nefarious bad things, but not on disinformation.
Yeah, so they had processes for users to report this type of thing. I don't know. I mean, Telegram's famously a tiny company for how many users it's got. It's something like 30 people on the entire team, which is incredible. And it also shows you like what's going on at these other companies that they need tens of thousands of employees at Meta or at within Instagram.
And message Apple, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot, of course, there's business people, marketing people, et cetera, but a lot of the staff are dedicated to moderation, content moderation, because you need thousands of people monitoring what's going on, interfacing with governments, interfacing with local authorities to then take action when something comes up. As we saw at the highest level, it was done directly by the White House, when the White House is just messaging Meta executives to say, this piece of content should not be on the platform. And that's not something that Telegram was structured, was not set up to do as a business. And I'm guessing that has to do with Pavel's own thoughts of how a platform should be run as an open platform and not as one that is sort of an extension of government or sort of interwoven into government mechanisms for shutting down speech.
Macron, the president of France, insists that this is not a political matter, it's a matter for the judiciary. I'm struggling to make sense of what exactly is going on. What do you think of the motivations behind his arrest?
I think the motivations of his arrest come down to the fact that, again, he would not play ball with government on disinformation. But, and this is the big but in the whole story, and I'm not going to take credit for the idea. I think I'd refer people to Mike Benz, who's a big voice on this issue, which is that it's hard to imagine a scenario where this came directly from France without the United States being involved in his detainment and arrest. the United States has perhaps the strongest interest and the biggest ability to take these kinds of actions. And you can see this by the fact that, again, this is according to what Mike has to say. I spoke to him yesterday about this. You can see this by the fact that there has been no protest from the American government over this stuff. Even though Pavel's not an American citizen, Telegram has been used as an American intelligence asset, as a tool for American intelligence. For example, with the 2021 Belarus uprising against the government there, the pro-Russian government in Belarus, where the United States was coordinating protests in order to oust the leader of Belarus at the time. And that worked very well for the State Department in particular to try to affect that kind of outcome in Belarus. But what we've seen since then is that Telegram has become very popular with people in Russia and people in other parts of the world where the United States is trying to exert influence on that platform, but cannot because Telegram will not play ball with them. That's, I think, the big story here, and the piece of the story that we're not really seeing in the media, of course, which is the American piece in the puzzle.
Okay. And this is actually exactly what Durov said in an interview with Tucker Carlson, that the FBI had attempted to, I think it was one of his leading staff members, to try and become an agent of the FBI, to get a foot in the door. What about the European aspect? So you mentioned the EU Disinfo Lab, an NGO, and I think of a little bit, stepping back a little bit, of what Thierry Breton said before the Trump-Elon Musk Twitter Spaces conversation from only a couple of weeks ago, threatening Musk to remember the Digital Securities Act and not to spread disinformation, as if Musk and Trump care at all what some Europrat had to say. What's the European angle on this? Like, what's your intel into this, the European regime on Telegram?
I mean, I think it's an echo of what the Americans are doing. I think maybe the one difference is that a lot of the platforms that we're seeing, the major tech platforms, are of course American. So if they cooperate, there is maybe a little bit of a closer involvement with the Americans, where the EU is passing these very broad and very intense set pieces of legislation like the DSA. And with Breton, what we saw was, an active threat with regard to X. A lot of this stems back to so-called election.
There's an empty threat in it. What can they actually do?
They can fine. They can levy heavy fines.
Right.
They can levy up to 6%, I think, of revenue. They can shut down services.
But again, but the 6%, Elon Musk has said abundantly clear he's not doing this for money. And if he was, he wouldn't have spent $44 billion on Twitter. So that doesn't seem like a real threat that he would care about.
Well, the real thing that we just saw that they can do is arrest the CEO. I mean, Pavel is a billionaire, is presumably a fairly influential, if not powerful figure. He has now a nation state backing him, the UAE, as you pointed out. And he's still under arrest, right? So maybe they won't or couldn't arrest Musk, but it's got to be on his mind. I mean, how many people are there in the world of Pavel's stature, and he's sitting in jail? It sends a message, at the very least. And maybe it's not Musk who gets arrested in that scenario, but maybe it's the CEO or somebody else. And that would, I would think, create a culture of fear inside of X. And it also sends a message to advertisers. I mean, that's the big piece of this. Musk has to be running a business. He is running a business. You know, he's not doing it for the money, but it has to sustain itself. And with advertisers running scared, I'm not sure how he's able to do that.
Seeing this story, particularly if, like me, one doesn't know that much about this kind of world, two prior examples come to mind. One is of Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht, who is now serving life in prison. And of course, Julian Assange, who has just been released and is back home in Australia. Should we understand what's happening to Pavel Durov in the same sort of context?
I for sure think it has the same contours. I mean, Ross was running a platform, and it was a platform that was sort of, you could say, off-grid, right? It was not connected to any of the traditional nodes of the establishment. And that would include like brand advertising, marketing, the government, or media. And that's the kind of thing that can get someone like Russ into a lot of trouble. The accusations was of money laundering, terrorism, child abuse, all this kind of stuff, where it's like, the question there is, was Ross actually trafficking humans? Was he dealing heroin on the site? He himself, because he's the one sitting in jail. I think the answer is probably no. I don't think he was trafficking people. I don't think he was dealing drugs. I think he was running a platform that was objectionable, was disfavored by people in power. And that's enough. That's enough today to get that conviction. And Assange, similar story. I mean, what exactly did Assange do that the media doesn't do every day? By reporting on government, by leaking documents. He did it in a large single dump, but he didn't play ball the way that the media plays ball with the government. So, one of the things I talk about in my book is when Kennedy was launching Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, and obviously the Americans did not want this to be known before. And I believe the editor of the New York Times called him and said, "Could you not run the story, please?" And they said, "Okay." They didn't run the story. And it's not uncommon in the media. That willingness, that give and take with the government, is a kind of protection. It's a kind of insurance policy that you're not going to go too far. And they never do go too far. They stay within the bounds and they cooperate wisely, I think. In the case of Assange, he did not do that, but he also leaked a trove of documents and emails that were very harmful to Hillary Clinton. And I think this is another point we miss in a lot of the disinformation discussion, which is the role that Hillary Clinton has played in sort of rousing this entire pushback against so-called disinformation.
Yeah, what role has she played?
This was really... So the disinformation, misinformation paradigm emerged in the wake of 2016 with the Trump election. He's elected president. Nobody thought it was possible. He was still is seen as this massively destabilizing force to the establishment, to the so-called world order. And he gets elected. At the same time, we have this huge media narrative about all the Russian disinformation that had been poured into the election and had really determined the outcome of the election. It turns out that's not true. There have been a number of pretty good studies to show that it made zero impact on the election outcome. Nothing. And this is studies by people from Stanford, NYU, and places like that. But
there's even of the famous example is the famous or the story of the P gate. Is the person who had come, the source of that story admitted that he'd just heard it. It was just speculative or conjecture. He didn't actually have any evidence that it was true. It's just one famous example. And then there's the Steele dossier, of course, as well.
Absolutely. And
which was funded by Hillary's campaign.
Yes, it was not. So this is kind of something that's been a little truncated. The Steele dossier wasn't just in itself funded by Clinton. That's one thing. The firm that pulled it together, Fusion GPS, spent the next 4 years disseminating it as sort of a super PR agency, opposition PR agency, working extremely closely with the media. And we know this because, of all places, the Columbia Journalism Review, this is the most prestigious publication in journalism, did a 4-part series by a former New York Times investigative reporter, Pulitzer winner, named Jeff Gerth, showing how this was done and demonstrating that the vast majority of those storylines were either completely false or just unsubstantiated. And the entire thing was a house of cards. No one has ever gone and done the reporting aside from Jeff in CJR and some publications that are on the right. No one has gone back and looked, how did this happen? Because it was effective. This disinformation narrative was effective. And Hillary Clinton was the first to sort of ring this alarm bell about disinformation. She did it approximately 4 weeks after the election, after she lost the election. She comes out saying, we are facing an epidemic of fake news. And that's sort of what kicked it off. knowing the kind of incredibly savvy, incredibly smart and powerful person that Hillary Clinton is in this world, and I, in a way, very much respect it and admire it, it's hard to imagine that she wasn't also taking action to get this done. But really, that was the turning point, 2016 and the Trump election. Without Trump winning this election, it's hard to imagine that the disinfo, misinfo paradigm would have come into being.
So it's interesting that she used the word fake news there, because up until that point, that had been the word favored, or the phrase favored by Trump. And then she, as soon as they're losing, they use it.
They co-opted it. Yeah. And then it gradually began to slide from fake news into disinformation. Fake news has this kind of gimmicky ring to it, where disinformation sounds really dark and
serious and authentic, right?
And
official
and strategic. You know, it sounds like somebody is got this master plan. It's not a coincidence that we appended the modifier Russian to almost every instance of disinformation. There's some bad guy in the Kremlin who's pulling all the strings, and these people are so effective that they can manipulate American elections, but they can't quite run their own country. Like, it doesn't really add up. But again, the data show, investigations show that there was not really an impact. It just didn't work. The American electoral system is really robust. It's been built over centuries. There are a lot of mechanisms to fight this kind of thing, and it worked. And the same thing you asked about the EU back in May of this year, where the EU had these big elections coming up in June. The EU comes out declaring that they're facing a tidal wave, an avalanche of expected disinformation that would disrupt or meddle with or interfere with the EU elections. And they had to take all these actions. And this is where Breton's coming out with a lot of this kind of stuff. And the elections went just fine. There was no coordinated campaign to disrupt those elections. It just didn't happen. And this is what we're seeing again and again and again, these incredibly alarmist risk awareness campaigns that followed by just nothing.
And this ties into what's going on with Mark Zuckerberg's letter then. So he has published this letter saying that he regrets falling to pressure from the Biden-Harris administration on censoring so-called disinformation, so-called misinformation. Right. And I've also heard now malinformation, which is true information
that's the best one.
Could lead to negative outcomes or so-called apparent negative outcomes. What do you think's the motivation behind Zuckerberg? What was your takeaway from that letter?
So initially, I was kind of like, okay, well, good for him. He's done the right thing. And then you start to think, well, this is 2024. That happened in 2020. It happened on the eve of a major election. So we're talking about election interference.
Well, you're talking about Hunter Biden laptop story.
Yeah, the Hunter Biden laptop story. I mean, the COVID thing is the same thing. It's in the middle of a pandemic, right? It's just as crucial. But the Hunter Biden laptop story, which they also censored, they call it demoted, that could have had a determinative impact on the election results. Here you have this laptop from the candidate's son, the former vice president, with emails having to do with Ukrainian energy companies, whatever the truth may be about whether or not Hunter Biden was a cutout for illicit business activity on behalf of his father, it sort of is less important than what it could have done to the election had the information been allowed to flow freely. So this is an actual case of election interference.
It's a complete inverse of what you're talking about earlier. So this is actual, before there was no Russian disinformation. Right. Now they're fabricating Russian disinformation.
Right. And if we remember when Hillary lost the election in 2016, a lot of it was chalked up to the fact that the email stuff had been coming out, that she was operating a private server illegally in her home, where she should have had all those things on official government servers so it could be preserved. I think that the Democratic apparatus, the DNC, was thinking, "Oh my God, this is going to happen again." On the in the US, they call it the October surprise, and this was the mother of all October surprises. And it just could not happen. It just could not be allowed. And here we have this incredibly effective and convenient tool of disinformation to say, hold on a second, this is disinformation. And you have all these former intelligence officials coming out, signing this letter.
51 agents saying that it was Russian disinformation.
Right.
We know now that they knew it wasn't
exactly
Russian disinformation. We don't have the names of the individuals, by the way, so they can't be held to account. And this was the front page of the New York Post. We know through the Twitter files that they took that story was completely censored. Zuckerberg, now this isn't news to me from his letter from this week, because he admitted on Rogan 2022
right.
that he had been told by federal agents or intelligence agents that he had to, that it might be Russian disinformation, so demote it. That wasn't news to me, but the motivation seemed to be to try and nip it in the bud to not affect the election. That's your take.
That was my take on what happened at that time, which is just do whatever it takes to clamp down.
Okay.
And we'll deal with the fallout later. And what is the fallout? There's no fallout. What difference does it make? Like, no one's going to be held accountable.
There is literally no fallout, by the way, because this is what by the Missouri case played out in June of this year.
Right.
Is what the Supreme Court judged is that technically the First Amendment, it says that the government cannot coerce. I think it's coerce is the word.
Yes.
So there's no evidence that they coerced.
Yeah.
Pressured is the word that Zuckerberg used, which is not the same as coerced.
Yeah.
And so they decided, actually, we can't prosecute in the Biden-Harris administration under these terms. So it wasn't a violation of the First Amendment.
So in that case, Murphy versus Missouri, my understanding is that there is precedent to say pressure is the sort of equivalent to coercion.
Oh, really?
Yes. My understanding of that case was that it was lost on the grounds that the states who brought it did not have standing to bring the case. I was just speaking with a civil rights, civil liberties attorney about this the other day, who's actually active in that case. But nevertheless, the point stands that nothing happened at the end of the day. There were no consequences. No one's held accountable. For Zuck, it kind of looks, maybe it's like a little bit of egg on the face, but part of what I was, when I saw his letter, part of my reaction was like, oh, he thinks Trump is going to win in November. So you're kind of like, and
so
even if he doesn't.
That's a very cynical take. So he sees the power shifting.
Yeah.
And he's like, actually, I want to be on the winning side.
Yeah. And, we're seeing this massive rebrand with Zuck where he's like flying the American flag and he's got the gold chain and he's become this like, he looks like an influencer and he's like saying all the things where before.
You said Trump looked like a badass.
Like a badass.
Attempt.
Exactly. It was the most badass thing I've ever seen. And this is such a 180 for a guy that was just so buttoned down in terms of the way he approached public facing interactions. Talking about himself and his business. He didn't do this kind of thing. He was just, and now we're seeing this shift with Zuck, which is, people like it. It's inspiring, I guess. But there's also something where you can feel him following the culture and maybe the politics. So the politics are kind of moving in that direction. I feel like what we're seeing is that the Democratic Party and the establishment are trying to maintain this grip, but it's kind of slipping through their fingers because at the end of the day, readers aren't buying it anymore. So people are watching this stuff happening. They're saying, I'm not so sure about this disinfo stuff. Sounds a bit vague, a bit fishy. I've heard it again and again. There's only so many times you can hit someone over the head before they're going to turn around and be like, could you please stop? I think this is what we're seeing. And Zuck's probably paying attention to that.
Wasn't he did he donate to the Biden? I don't actually know. I have to look.
I'm not sure. My guess is that a lot of these guys who do donate to both parties. Right.
Well, we're seeing in Silicon Valley, big tech, a movement. And obviously, Elon Musk is at the front of that. After the assassination attempt, openly endorsing Trump.
Yeah.
But we see other big names like David Sachs and people who in 2016, 2020, if they supported Trump, they were quiet about it.
Yeah.
It seems now people are quite open and unapologetic in supporting Trump. And so is it that Zuckerberg is perhaps just sort of like a weathercock, and he sees that in his circles, the mood is like, actually, let's back Trump. This is the regime we want to support. So you think it's as cynical as that, and he wants to support them?
It could be. Zuck is an extremely canny guy. I mean, this guy, he's been in these worlds since he's 20 years old, in power, in the inner chambers of everything, meeting with presidents, world leaders, and you want to make sure you're on the winning side. And like you said, we have seen this huge shift. I wrote about this last month for Spectator in the US, where just this massive shift towards tech among the tech elite. So not necessarily rank and file workers in Silicon Valley, but leading VCs like David Sachs, his co-host on the All In podcast, Chamath. Obviously, Peter Thiel was always a supporter. Mark Andreessen has now come out. Ben Horowitz, just stuff that, like you're pointing out, unimaginable only a couple of years ago, where now people are starting to see that what's happened under Biden and Harris is borderline, and maybe actually just actual incompetence on business issues. So like these guys, their businesses are being hurt by crazy regulation, by weird tax proposals, by sort of just muddying the waters of crypto regulation without making real decisions. And for the piece I just talked about, I spoke with like Democrats, San Francisco Democrats, who are saying, I can't believe I'm saying this, and I'm not sure I'm going to vote for Trump, but I could see the case for him on account of what they're seeing in their own backyard.
That was unimaginable 8 years ago or 4 years ago.
Insane. Like lifelong Democrats, one guy I spoke to from Brooklyn and saying to me, what's happened under Biden Harris with this kind of just making an enormous mess because so much of that is ideologically driven, going after companies for the sake of going after companies rather than to protect consumers or to benefit consumers. That kind of thing where you're starting to ask yourself, what are the actual motivations here? And what is the real logic? And that's what these guys, I think, are asking themselves as well and saying, I think it's just a smarter bet.
Another aspect of Zuckerberg's letter was COVID disinformation. We talked now about Hunter and that story, but the COVID angle, what's your make of that? And it seems to me that it's something that there will be no repercussions for, similar to the Hunter Biden cover up. There will be, these people are going to be let off the hook. It's kind of, is there even appetite to follow through on an inquiry or in the States at least? We had an inquiry here, but what's this turnaround for Zuckerberg? What's your analysis of that aspect?
I think there will not be repercussions for that kind of thing where Zuckerberg's being pressured or leaned on or whatever, Facebook and all the other major platforms, because there is no person to name. Who are you going to identify? Some functionary in the bureaucracy of the White House no, it's never going to happen. It is what it is. I think the repercussion is on a cultural level where people are saying, no, thank you. I prefer to have at least an open flow of information, even if it means that what gets in part of the pipeline is carrying something that looks a lot like shit. Okay, I'm willing to pay that price as long as I can get something that is not filtered on my behalf by my government. On the question of, the actual question, and this is part of the thing with disinformation, is that when you start talking about disinformation, is it disinformation? Isn't it disinformation? You stop talking about the actual thing that you were supposed to have been talking about in the first place. So with the Hunter Biden laptop, we were actually supposed to be talking about Biden's alleged corruption in Ukraine. We're not talking about that anymore. We're talking about disinformation now. In the case of COVID, we were actually supposed to be talking about where this virus came from and how were we pushed vaccines that we now know were not effective and were potentially harmful to certain groups. That's the real conversation. we're not having that conversation. We instead are having this whole other disinformation and misinformation, malinformation, all these terms, all these jargon. You have to keep up with it, which is resembles like the woke DEI thing, where it's like, just to be able to talk about it, you have to spend minutes of your day learning this evolving vocabulary, this lexicon about microaggressions, and then cultural appropriation, then the next thing, and then like pronouns. And you're no longer talking about, in this case, well, maybe this was actually engineered in a lab in China, as we have plenty of at least circumstantial evidence to suggest that it could have been, very well could have been. Not only could have been, that there was an intent to do that, to do exactly what was produced, what would have been produced as SARS-CoV-2. And we're just not talking about that anymore.
It's like a sort of cloak of complexity by intention to get us away from that. So
yes,
it's
I call it the informational stew, because you just drop in this ingredient, that ingredient, that ingredient. Some of it's true, some of it are lies, some of it are falsehoods, some of it are blah blah blah, and you stew it. And at the end of the day, if you're trying to figure out what are the ingredients, you can't. It's a stew. You don't know. So when I think about the origin of COVID, which is something that I investigated with a bunch of other researchers and journalists, we spent the first 2 to 3 years just trying to find the basic facts. Who, what, where, when. You can't figure it out because it's such a mess. It's hidden. The Chinese are changing the names of virus sequences in their databases. They're erasing the databases. They're putting them back up. The US government's doing all this kind of stuff. They're redacting documents. Then they're unredacting documents. They're partially. You're just churning through this. You're burning intellectual calories trying to figure out the basics before you can even come to a conclusion. It's extremely effective, which is why sometimes the truth can come out because it doesn't matter. And in fact, it helps to obscure the bigger picture.
We got to, it was, I believe, May or probably June 2023 that the Wall Street Journal confirmed Michael Schellenberger's report that the first 3 patients were from the COVID lab. Why this is relevant here is that I know people who were censored on Facebook for positing the COVID lab theory. That story, it seems like that was obvious. I mean, someone like you must, I know you've done all this investigation, it seems that was quite clear from the beginning to most of us paying attention. It must have been at least a likely option for where it had come from. So then Zuckerberg now puts out this letter. I'm kind of like, no shit. Like we sort of know all of this. Why is this such a big deal, this Zuckerberg letter?
I think it's a big deal because it confirms what we already knew, which is not so much that there was pressure. We knew that. It confirms that there was active participation by the social media platforms. And it confirms that it's so easy for Zuck to put out a letter. It costs him nothing. It's free. And it doesn't matter. And now we all know that. We all know that the repercussion is zero. That you can do this. You can tell people that the truth is a lie. Not only that it's a lie, but that to speak that truth is a crime. And then at the end of the day, we see in front of our own eyes that all Zuck has to do is open a Word document, type, probably not even doing it himself, almost certainly not. His lawyers are doing it. Publish it. You're good. That's it. That's all it took. 20 minutes, an hour. That's it. For 3-4 years, people around the world were censored. They suffered material harm, in some cases to their livelihoods, in some cases to their health, in some cases just to their rights. And I think like the third thing, their rights, this is kind of, because it's intangible, we forget about it. And this is something that I talk about with Lionel Shriver sometimes, or she talks about, which is that she says, we all just rolled over. We just rolled over. And you're kind of like, yeah, you're right. Because we came to accept the fact that the government was a guardian of our rights. when that's not true. The truth is that the guardian of our rights is us.
Mm.
And the people who are sort of organically predisposed to infringing upon those rights are the government.
Mm. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, the Stanford epidemiologist and one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was censored.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm almost certain censored on Facebook, but certainly on other platforms. He makes the case that actually censorship kills. And had they not censored things like the Great Barrington Declaration, that fewer people would have died. So it's a pretty
100%.
serious,
Yes,
almost basic principle. But
yeah, and to be Jay, to take that kind of action, you have to risk everything. That's the incredible thing. It's such an imbalance of risk, because to stay quiet, you have no repercussion, or you get lauded and applauded, like a lot of the virus people who came out saying, lock it down harder, flatten that curve.
Mm.
They got all the plaudits. They got all the gigs on CNN, which some of which were very likely paid, where to come out and say, like, as Jay and his colleagues did with the Great Barrington Declaration, you risk everything. You risk your reputation. You risk your career. You risk your family's safety. And I know there was, with some of those people, they had repercussions for their family, not surprisingly. And the same thing with Matt Ridley and Alina Chan, predominantly Alina, who was the first person to really put a serious spotlight as a scientific researcher on the question of a lab origin.
This was their book Viral.
Their book Viral. Yeah. And she had come out on Twitter before the book, saying that which could not be said, which is that, wait a second, there is a research lab in Wuhan that has the largest collection of bat-borne coronaviruses in the world, where they're doing risky research to make these viruses more virulent and deadly, and where the safety practices were known to be substandard. Maybe, just maybe.
Hear me out.
Yeah. And for that, she was pilloried. She was discredited. She was smeared. She still is, actively, to this day, every single day. And that's the kind of imbalance of risk where you face with these kinds of conversations.
Now that we have 4 years and a bit of hindsight, it seems bizarre. And if you were to write a book about it, it would seem sort of like a comedy, a tragic comedy.
Yeah.
Why was that so offensive an idea? Because actually the idea that the COVID originated from a wet market it's more racist than the idea that it originated in a COVID lab.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was so offensive to people?
I don't think it was offensive to people. I think, at least not naturally. So when you trace that particular narrative, what you see is that narrative began with Chinese state-owned so-called news outlets and Chinese government officials. One of the earliest cases was the Chinese ambassador to the United States went on, I believe it was CBS, I have to double check that, did this big interview where he comes out saying questions regarding a possible lab origin of the virus are racist and xenophobic and discriminatory. China Daily, which is a Chinese propaganda outlet in English, was publishing exactly the same claim. This was well before it was being made in the US, the American media, or around the world. Gradually, that starts seeping into the US media, and then they run with it because, of course, this is in the midst of all the woke, racial, BLM reckoning stuff. I mean, it was predates BLM a little bit, but it was all bubbling to the surface. My guess is that the Chinese understood that very well. I mean, these are masters of propaganda. They saw what was going on. They saw a vulnerability in this racial conversation in the US, which would have been completely alien to China itself. And they saw, okay, if we sort of splice this conversation about the origin of the virus into this cultural moment, we can win. And they did, because the media loved it. They loved it. In 2021, a New York Times health reporter tweeted saying that lab leak is inherently racist. It's an inherently racist idea. Why? It's unclear why. I don't think there's any logic, any conceivable logic to that. It's just that it was a narrative that really worked for a lot of different people.
It's so utterly bizarre that not only are the purveyors of correct information at least seemingly protecting the regime that they have a vested interest in. Let's say you mentioned Hillary Clinton at the beginning of this conversation, but here we have it that they're actually supporting and propagandizing for the CCP. They're happily eating up, lapping up CCP disinformation.
But there was a link there. There was a link between the CCP, between China and the US media, and that was the American science establishment, or maybe even the global science establishment. Because the first real piece of so-called evidence, it wasn't actually evidence, it was a letter signed by, I think, 27 scientists, published in The Lancet. I think it was in March 2020, coming out and saying, no, there is scientific consensus that this came from an animal, and to suggest otherwise is racist. So a month after Chinese officials and Chinese media start talking about this racist thing, the science community publishes this letter. And when I say science community, it wasn't actually the science community, but it was taken to be as such by the media. The person who actually organized the Lancet letter was Peter Daszak, who's the guy who was funding the lab in Wuhan. He was the sort of pass-through from U.S. taxpayer money from NIH and NIAID under Fauci to the lab in Wuhan. He had more to lose than almost any other single person on Earth if this were to come out as developed in a lab. He was the guy that published this letter, organized and published the letter in the Lancet, and from there, then you could have the media saying, "Look, this is the evidence." There was no study. There was no serious analysis of this. There was no investigation. And evidence of that is that 4 years later, we still don't know. We still don't know where it came from. Every scientist will tell you we don't know. That's a fact. But 1 month after they started investigating, they suddenly had an answer that was declared a consensus. Obviously not. The key to that letter, in my opinion, was this line about it being racist, because then it became off limits. That was the key to it.
This is in the context, of course, of what year was this? 2020?
2020.
So this is right in the middle of George Floyd, right? Or is it just before?
It was I think it was just before George Floyd, but it was we were well into that, in that environment, that ecosystem where this was right where the anti-racism conversation was starting to take off. The book by Ibram Kendi was published already. It was like working its way through the system. And to say something racist was like, it was like chopping off a baby's head or something. Like you could not do something as bad as commit a racial offense in that cultural context.
Okay. And was the lab, is this, forgive me if we go into a bit deeper into the COVID thing, but this started after Obama outlawed gain of function in the US, and then so those operations were moved to China. Is that sort of the beginning?
There was part of that. So that was the moratorium that Obama placed in, I think, 2014. What had happened was two different sets of researchers around 2012, 2013 had created a strain of bird flu that could infect humans through the air. Bird flu, the numbers, I'd have to refer back to the numbers, but let's say orders of magnitude more deadly than COVID. So if this is something that escapes from a lab, we're talking not a pandemic. We're talking about a threat of extinction, which sounds so insane to say. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it was that serious that the Obama administration was saying, wait a second, we need to slow down. The person who was pushing against that was Fauci. The person who was pushing, so initially when these studies were about to come out and to be published for the world to see, the NIH has a safety board that said, this should not be published publicly. This is stuff that could be made in a small lab anywhere in the world by whoever. And if they get the hands on the map, they can just do that. Fauci overruled that decision and allowed for the studies to be published. Once they were, people start to understand how big of a threat this could be. That led to the moratorium. It's not totally clear to me, at least, I'm sure there is to others out there, exactly where the initial research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology began within that timeline. Certainly, there was a study in 2015 by Ralph Barrick from University of North Carolina and Shixing Li at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they produced something that was later called by an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists a prototype for SARS-CoV-2. They were taking bat-borne coronaviruses, inserting new structures to make them potentially more infectious and more dangerous to human beings. That was the first time that kind of work was done in that lab. That study was funded by NIH, NIAID, Fauci, and it was also funded, weirdly, by USAID, the State Department's foreign aid organization, which is known as an organization that has worked extensively with the CIA in the past, including the recent past. So this is again, another extremely just weird bundling of forces and people. But I think the real point to take away from there is that it's very easy to say this was all China CCP, but that's just not true. It was, if something happened in that lab, it was at least as much an American involvement in what was produced there.
So you have written a piece, How the Regime Captured Wikipedia. And this is something that we were DMing about a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in this. I think that this ties it, well, I suspect it ties into our earlier conversation about Pavel Durov and Zuckerberg, big tech, and so on and so forth, social media giants. My personal experience with Wikipedia, and I say this as a preamble, is firstly, any of us who have cursed enough to have a Wikipedia page knows it's riddled with lies.
Yeah.
My Wikipedia page are riddled with lies. It seems to be impossible to get rid of them. I don't sure how to do them. The worst experience I had with Wikipedia was that a few years ago when I came under fire and had a Twitter storm around me because of my endorsing a book by American conservative journalist Andy Ngo about Antifa.
Right.
The Wikipedia hornets came after my page and changed it from Winston Marshall. At the time, I was a banjo player. Winston Marshall player is a musician, a banjo player, to Winston Marshall is a fascist. And it was a friend of mine who happens to have access as an editor. I'm not quite sure how it works. You'll explain to me. Mm-hmm. Was then spent the whole night trying to change it back. Yeah. And then the hornets were back trying to change it. So it was clear to me, and it should be clear to anyone who has a Wikipedia page, that it's a completely corrupt institution, organization. You have done a big investigation into it, and I want to know how Wikipedia really works.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I love the concept of Wikipedia. Like I told you back in the day when I was working at the Internet Archive from the Wayback Machine people, and there was this whole network of people who really believed in open source knowledge. So it was like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Creative Commons people, and Wikipedia was sort of fit into that. And that's what the original vision was about. Decentralized. Anyone can edit it, which means that no single person, no single entity gets to control what we consider knowledge. But the piece that you're talking about in Pirate Wires, which is an awesome publication that I've recently started working with, it's really about a enormous structural shift at Wikipedia that started to take place around the same time that we just talked about regarding the disinformation timelines. So 2016, 2017, they start to implement something called the movement strategy, or sometimes they call it Wikipedia 2030. And this was really, in effect, a centralizing impulse at Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is owned by the Wikimedia Foundation. And the Wikimedia Foundation, I think, generally had been a bit hands-off until a woman named Catherine Maher became CEO. She's now today CEO of NPR. And when she became CEO of NPR, there's all the stuff coming out about her making these extremely
She said the
troubling.
First Amendment was a problem to get around.
Exactly. That kind of stuff.
That's just the surface. There's a lot more.
A lot more stuff like that. This is like one of these people really embedded in the whole like TED Talk thing, and all these different kinds of boards and foundations that she served on. And under Maher, Wikimedia Foundation decides to sort of reimagine itself for the future. And again, the key here is understanding this in the context of the misinformation, disinformation conversation that was emerging in the wake of the 2016 election. What they saw was that decentralized knowledge was a threat. It's a risk, because that means anyone could say anything, like with Telegram. The sort of modus operandi for these kinds of organizations and foundations was speech has to be controlled for the benefit of society. And that's what Wikimedia Foundation sort of set out to do. They began partnering with a extremely hard left progressive foundation called Tides, which is a $1 billion foundation and is responsible for making grants to hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller organizations that do things like campaign to defund the police and shut down bridges in San Francisco for pro-Palestinian demonstrations, that kind of stuff. The goal here was to create an endowment within Wikimedia Foundation that would provide, at least nominally, funding for the future of Wikipedia. They wanted to raise $100 million. They blew by that within a few years. They're currently at around $150 million in the endowment. The endowment, the Wikimedia endowment, sat within the Tides Foundation. Tides sent its general counsel over to Wikimedia Foundation, and she became general counsel at Wikimedia Foundation. It's like you're stitching these organizations together. Mm-hmm. And it's all, the stitching is money. So Wikimedia Foundation, you sometimes you see these kind of banners on Wikipedia asking for money, and people have been like very up in arms about this because they want your money. In reality, today, Wikimedia Foundation has $250 million on its own books, and that additional 140, probably more by now, $150 million in the endowment. So we're talking about $400 million just lying around. What are they doing with all that money? The site doesn't require that much money to maintain. What they are doing is they're doing similarly to what the Tides Foundation does. They're passing it through to activist organizations, organizations that are, again, working for equity in journalism, on disinformation stuff, on defund the police stuff, on this gamut of progressive causes. The other piece to this is Google, and Google is really where it all becomes relevant. Wikipedia on its own would have been and still could be nothing, completely irrelevant, just like a weirdo website in the corner of the internet, if it didn't appear as the first result in basically every single Google search that you do for like a relevant, meaningful topic. That's the key. Google, on the other hand, gets a lot of benefit from Wikipedia because it gets so-called high-quality content. Like if you Googled something and you get some like junky website in the first, second, or third result, you would just be like, this search engine sucks. But because you're seeing so much Wikipedia, including in that knowledge pane, sometimes that pops up on the side of a search, not in the listed results, you have this sort of illusion that there's not just quality, but neutrality. And it's this veil of neutrality that gives Wikipedia its power because it becomes useful to Google, and Google then promotes it in the search rankings and also funds it.
They're not just promoting it. As you said, it comes up in the side. It actually comes up as a standard on any Google search.
Yeah, that's right.
So they're completely in bed together.
Yes. And so once Wikimedia Foundation and Tides began this kind of weird marriage that they started, Google in those initial years began to donate enormous sums of money to Tides, where this endowment, this Wikimedia Foundation endowment, was sitting. So up until that point, Google was making annual annual donations to organizations on the order of, let's say, $500,000 or maybe $1 million, very rarely much more than that. By 2017, 18, 19, whatever the exact dates, Google's donations to Tides, which could pass through that money back to Wikipedia Foundation, ramps up to the order of $50 million, $70 million, I think $90 million. Unbelievable amounts of money. So again, you start to think what's going on. And when you come back to this context, the year, the disinformation campaign, this global network of organizations that are working on this issue, including, of course, the WEF is all mixed up in there. And what you see is a sort of a takeover. And that's why the headline is juicy, as we talked about, how the regime captured Wikipedia. But it's accurate at the end of the day. That is actually what happened. There's another piece coming soon at Powder Wires on exactly how the bias works on a mechanistic level. So this is about the money, but it's editors who are making those decisions, and they don't work for Wikimedia Foundation. They're volunteers. And a lot of the time they're anonymous. But it is what you said. It is a coordinated effort on anything having to do with politics.
Yeah, so let's go into the bias aspect. Sure. Although I appreciate that it's an ongoing investigation that you're doing, it's clear that there's a progressive bias with the Wikipedia editors. Why is that? Why is it that there's not just as many, let's say, conservative or liberal? Why is it so dominated by progressives? Yeah. A counter example that comes to mind, or maybe it's an attempt at doing it better, is community notes on Twitter, which similarly, I'm not sure exactly how it works, but the editors, I understand that for something to get community noted, you have to have a fair mix of both conservative or liberal, or people having a different opinions on general issues, agreeing on what the mistake is in the actual tweet. Right. Yeah. It seems like it's the least bad version of this, but why is it that the Wikipedia is so dominated by that? What has it rewarded progressives, or has it actively tried to avoid, downplay conservatives or make it difficult for liberal and conservative views to access it?
Yeah, I think there's two big reasons for it. One, or maybe three, but the two that come to mind initially are that what I've been told, because I asked that question to a few sources, exactly that question. The answer I got is that a lot of the top editors are academics or are in the world of academia, which in the US, and I'm sure here, swings wildly to the left. So you have the most powerful editors on the site. So when you're talking about influential editors, not every editor on Wikipedia is created equal. You have a pretty small cohort of editors editing political pages, like something that would have involved your page once the story with Andy broke out. These guys are in the 99.99 percentile of editors by the number of edits they make. And that's really important. Number of edits is extremely important because it gives them different kind of status, different kind of tools on the site. For example, if you get a certain number of edits, a certain level of experience and credibility, you can become an administrator. And that gives you the ability to ban other users from certain topics and even from certain topic areas. So you could say, someone could see your friend trying to correct the false claims about you on the page, where another editor could come in and say, no, we're going to change it back. We're going to change it back. And if you change it one more time, you're banned. And that's exactly what happens. So part of that goes back to where Wikipedia came from. I told you that Internet Archive and all these other organizations that were sort of connected to and adjacent to Wikipedia, where I was working, this came from the Bay Area, right? And where does the Bay Area swing? Obviously, extremely to the left, not just a little bit, not moderately to the left, extremely to the left, as far as you can go. That's where the site came from. It's where it was born. And these editors who were making not a few hundred edits over their lifetime as an editor, not even thousands, hundreds of thousands, and accrued the most power, were generally from that milieu. The other piece to this, though, and I think this is just as important, is that one of those editors, a guy named on the site called Mr. X, and again, this will be all detailed in the Pirate Wire's second edition of the Wikipedia reporting that I've done. In 2018, and once again, we see this mapping again to the disinformation, misinformation timeline, where it's all rising around that same period. Post 2016, we have Wikimedia Foundation and Tides joining together in 2017. Then in 2018, this guy, he creates a list of sources, media sources on the site with color coding for green, which are generally reliable, and red, which are generally unreliable. So on the generally reliable front, like if you just throw out any mainstream media publication, it will be green. You could say NBC, ABC, Politico, blah, 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 CNN, New York Times. The first and only green publication on the list was the New York Times. That was when he started the list. It grew over time. Today, you have even like the hardest left socialist, like outright socialist news sites like Jacobin, for example, or here The Independent, which is pretty far left, are green. On the flip side, Fox News is red. The Washington Examiner, the Washington Times. I mean, same thing. If you just tell me like a conservative news site, it's generally going to be red. And some are even what they call deprecated, which means they're not considered generally unreliable. They're forbidden. You have no equivalent on the left.
Who would be included in that category?
Undeprecated. I think Fox at one point was deprecated. Daily Mail is deprecated. It's prohibited for use on
still
site.
Today.
Yeah, still today. And it was the first first and only, I believe, red news outlet when Mr. X created this list.
Are there any left-wing outlets or media outlets that are deprecated?
I think there might be one or two, but they're so extreme. It's like the gray zone. You know what I mean? Like it's like so far out there that it's like they couldn't not, because it's like just crazy stuff. But what's also interesting is that Al Jazeera, owned by the state of Qatar, which is authoritarian, is green.
You're kidding.
China Daily, which we talked about, and Xinhua, which is a sister publication, it's the official publication of the Chinese Communist Party, is actually not red, it's yellow. It's considered somewhat reliable, somewhat unreliable. So
the Qatari propaganda machine that is Al Jazeera is
green,
considered green.
Yeah.
And Daily Mail is considered less reputable, have less good reputation than China CCP propaganda outlet.
Correct. So this was never accepted by the community. It was never like ratified. It just was. It just was one guy. So remember I said like the point of Wikipedia is that not one person is in control of what people consider to be knowledge. But here we have one guy defining for the whole world what's considered reliable and unreliable in the media. What this also means is that, and this is how Wikipedia actually works, if the mainstream media, these green publications, say something is true, then on Wikipedia, it is true.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be investigated. In fact, it can't be, because there's a policy in Wikipedia called no original research, which means they can't make their own determinations. They have to go with what the sources say. Then there's a further policy on Wikipedia called gaslighting, which means if you question a reliable source, if you question a news article, you are gaslighting, and that can get you banned. And the guy who created the gaslighting policy was also Mr. X. So here we have this whole mechanism of bias that's built into Wikipedia that wholly reflects what the mainstream media says about any given subject.
Completely biased. And so the whole thing, I have one small question, if I can backtrack one little second. It's about the motivations of the editors, because they're not being paid, right? You mentioned power. So they have power. Where are do they have status? Where are they? What exactly is their motivation? If you're doing hundreds of thousands of edits, that's a lot of your life that you're giving up to this Wikipedia. Where's the reward? Where do they get from it?
The reward is on the site, because, for us, we look at it and we're like, I got things to do and a job and whatever else, which a lot of these people do as well. But when you're in that world, it is so intense and intensive, and people believe in it so much. And at the end of the day, they're well aware of the influence that Wikipedia itself has. They know that if Donald Trump's Wikipedia article is edited to say he's a racist, then the world looks at that page and it's like, well, Wikipedia says he's a racist, right? So he's a racist. It changes reality, and they know that. So first you have this kind of like reality altering effect of Wikipedia. But then within the community, you have people like you see on a forum or chat on Reddit where people are sort of jostling on Twitter and X, where who can like pull the one over the other, and it gets status and more status and more followers. And it's that kind of hierarchy within the system as well. Who's an administrator, who is a member of the arbitration committee, which gets to make these really big decisions about bannings, who gets to ban who can say what. And at the end of the day, again, the most important thing here is which fact gets to stand. So for example, with this whole Kamala Harris border czar. Was she the border czar? Wasn't she the border czar? Biden appointed her to oversee border issues, but she was never he never used the word czar. So a couple weeks after all this came out, her Wikipedia on the list of border czars in the United States article, she's listed. Then the next day she's gone. So someone had put her on pretty recently, but then someone had taken her off, saying she's not the border czar. The media reported both versions.
Hey, I'll give you another one. The Hunter Biden laptop story.
Yeah.
And today, Wikipedia, the title of the page is Hunter Biden laptop controversy.
Yes.
But not, I think, only a few months ago, and it had been this way for years, it was the Hunter Biden laptop conspiracy.
Exactly.
They called it a conspiracy, even though we knew it was true. Wikipedia had it listed as a conspiracy.
Exactly. And the lab leak theory article on Wikipedia still today calls it a conspiracy theory. That article has almost 40 mentions of the term conspiracy theory. And I looked at like chemtrails as an example of an actual conspiracy theory. It's got about 50, right? So you're talking about a theory that has been backed by some of the most distinguished scientists in virology and epidemiology. And it's now just labeled a conspiracy theory just because someone somewhere in the media said it at some point. It doesn't matter that the media kind of backtracked, kind of didn't. So this is how this stuff gets codified into Wikipedia, which sort of, in a way, codifies it into our shared reality.
Well, forgive me for stating the obvious, but if you haven't got much time and you need to find out information quickly, you Google it. I do this.
Yeah.
And I check Wikipedia.
Of course.
For most normal people who don't have much time, you just need to find out information quickly.
It's for everybody.
So it's unbelievably effective in changing the narrative, I guess.
For any information or knowledge-based search that's not like retail or something like that, it's the starting point in 100% of searches. You start at Wikipedia, right? That's whatever you want to go from there, but you're starting there. So already your frame of reference is determined by the Wikipedia article on the topic.
Yeah. Can I pick you up on the word regime? I appreciate it might have been your editors rather than you that used that in the title, how the regime captured Wikipedia. So you've beautifully mapped out there the kind of web, but regime sort of implies that there's someone at the top maybe, or is this, what do you think, what did you mean by the word regime?
Yeah, it's actually interesting that the guys at Pirate Wires chose that term because
distancing yourself from it already.
No, I fully embrace it. I think that's actually they really nailed it with that. I'd love to take credit for it, but I can't. But I'd say like 3-4 years ago, I was on Twitter and having a conversation with someone. I forget who it was, but that sort of occurred to me as a term, which is the regime media, which I was referring to what we have in the United States. In other circumstances or in other years, you would have said like the regime media regarding China or Cuba or North Korea, where we know what that means. That means that there's like a very tight band of outlets that have approved messaging, and they work to push the messaging on to the populace for political purposes and ideological purposes. And when you take that model and you map it onto everything we just talked about today, you're like, it looks disturbingly similar when you're saying that Hunter Biden laptop is cast as a conspiracy theory, as is lab leak. There's political motivations, and not only political motivations, but there's direct interference by the people at the very height of power. And the media plays ball with it. The media runs with the narrative. And you think to yourself, okay, well, maybe it's not exactly, as extreme as what they have in North Korea. Surely it's not. There is dissent and we're allowed to dissent. But as I say that, you're also not allowed to dissent because we saw what happens when you do. You are kicked off social media, you're banned, you're blocked. I mean, my book, when the New York Times book came out, I was advertising on Facebook. I had a friend of mine who's a marketer who does that, and he just did it for me for free. And the engagement was insane. Like, it was just on fire. We weren't paying for it. It was all organic. And then boom, I get blocked from advertising on Facebook. I wasn't allowed to even pay them after that to advertise. I had to spend the next months jumping through hoops. They still block me. I still can't advertise on Facebook. So when you say you're allowed to speak, you're kind of allowed to speak, and you're kind of not.
Yeah. I know that's it's amazing what trouble a book can bring you. Let's go back to your book though, because this all ties together, and I want to kind of tie this all together at the end. Everything we've talked about, the mainstream media, these tech companies, and everything. But before we do that, I'm keen to get into the book, particularly as New York Times still enjoys respectability, at least in, let's say, half of Americans, and certainly on Wikipedia, and it's still prestigious to people.
Yeah,
I would love to be published by the New York Times, even though I absolutely deplore almost everything in its pages. Yeah. It's not nothing still.
Yeah.
You said at the beginning of this conversation how they were reprinting Nazi propaganda in the 30s.
Yeah.
You also reveal some of how they shilled for the Soviets and for Stalin, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, that was the famous or infamous story of Walter Duranty. He was the Russia correspondent for the New York Times in the late 20s and the early 1930s, and this was where the Soviet Union is just sort of settling into power. Stalin is rising, and one of the things Stalin has done or did at that point is sort of this purge of a caste of peasants that results in they're wealthy peasants, right? So they're not the proletariat. They're this like despised
the kulaks.
And because he does this, I mean, this is at least one read on what happened. He creates a famine because these are people who are providing an enormous amount of food to Ukraine, or at the time the Ukraine, was a region, and precipitates famine. And there's like different debates about why he did it. If it was like purposely to like just murder people to consolidate power, as Stalin was known to do. But the fact remains, on the order of at least a few million, upwards of potentially 5 million. Some have said 10 million. It's not clear, but in the millions of people were killed.
This is the Holodomor.
Yes, exactly. The Ukraine famine, Holodomor. And the New York Times, via Walter Duranty, who at the time was a absolute journalistic celebrity. If you pick out like our biggest journalistic celebrities today, like Maggie Haberman, or like these huge personalities, like globally known, that's who he was. He runs with this obvious lie, by today's perspective, that there was no famine. It didn't happen. He's saying, yeah, there were some shortages, but no famine. People have since understood that he lied about this. The question that I asked in the book and sort of did a little more research after the book was, why would he do that? Like, he didn't care. He wasn't a communist. He was a self-promoter. And whenever you have a journalist who sees a major story, like a massive story, and saying, nope, nothing here, like lab leak, something is weird. Journalists want more than anything for there to be a story, not for there not to be the story. Nobody wants to be like, no, there's no story. Yeah, it's just fine. Like it goes against every instinct a journalist has. The answer to that question is, it wasn't Walter Duranty. It was the New York Times who pushed him to repeat this lie. And the reason was, so at the time, there was this big debate about whether the United States would recognize the Soviet Union as the legitimate government of Russia, which they had not done. The Russians, the Soviets, really wanted this because it would legitimize the regime. The other people who really wanted this was a group of very wealthy, powerful business people in the United States who see this huge, rapidly industrializing market that they could sell to and export to and import from materials from Russia and sell into the market, which at the time they could not do because they didn't have diplomatic relations. So these guys were pushing for this, but you could not get that done if that regime had just murdered 5 million of its own people for no reason. No president would do that. FDR, at the time that Durante was covering this up, was preparing to run for president. He meets with FDR as governor and explicitly advises him to recognize the Soviets. FDR becomes president and then recognizes the Soviet government. There's a party for both the new ambassadors, the ambassador from the US to the Soviet Union and vice versa, at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. Thousands of people are there. Teddy Roosevelt's son is there. The head of railroads, the head of banks, the head of telecom companies are there. Only one guy got a standing ovation that night, and that was Walter Durante. You think, why would they stand up and applaud? Why would the ambassador from the Soviet Union applaud an American journalist? It's because he paved the way. And it was the New York Times that led this effort. The New York Times that was deeply connected to all of those business concerns. That is the bigger story, I think, of Walter Durante. Because today, what the New York Times has done is said they've tried to quarantine his legacy, say, rogue reporter. And when it came out, I think like in the early 2000s, Ukrainian Americans started to push. He won a Pulitzer for that reporting, by the way. He won a Pulitzer for denying that there was a famine. Ukrainian Americans start pushing to say, you should give the Pulitzer back. That you don't, as a news organization, that's obviously illegitimate. The New York Times goes out and hires a historian to analyze the situation. Lo and behold, he comes back and says, you should give it back. And they say no, they refuse. And the reason they refuse is because to do so would be sort of like an admission of institutional guilt. They want to keep this, they describe him as a slovenly reporter, which absolutely he was not. He was a polyglot. He had gone to Cambridge. He was an extremely intelligent, capable person. But they still today want to keep this distant from the organization, the institution itself. And probably for that reason, they just don't want people to think that this was bigger than Durante.
So they ostracize him. My question when I hear you speaking there is, how is it that the New York Times, not just with this instance, but as you said earlier with the Nazis, and then in your book you lay out several other incidences. As I said earlier, there's still something prestigious about the New York Times. How is it that they have survived all of these unbelievable journalistic blunders, time and time again, up until recently with the 1619 project, which you will also write about? How is it they maintain their popularity, their reputation?
Yeah, and the prestige.
Yeah, the prestige.
Yeah. The answer to that, in my opinion, is that they haven't maintained the prestige in spite of these things, but because of these things. So when we go back to the World War II reporting about Poland attacking Germany, part of the story here, a big part of the story, was that the guy running the Berlin bureau for the New York Times in the lead up to World War II was a Nazi, was a Nazi sympathizer. I would call him a collaborator because he was printing reports that were so flattering to the Nazis that the Nazis would just read New York Times aloud on their own radio without editing them. It's like one of the most censorship heavy regimes in history, but they could feel free to read some of these reports uncensored. Why did they knew this, right? So a Jewish editor came to them in New York saying, you have a Nazi running your Berlin bureau. What is going on here? They threatened that guy with a libel suit, if he came out and said that. The reason is because they had a really good deal. What it meant when the Nazis loved your reporting is that you get access to everybody. You get access to the top brass, to the top politicians. You get the best stories. You get them before anybody else. To replace him in the middle of that war would have just collapsed their ability to do that kind of reporting, to stay number one. That's the key. Stay number one. What happened after Durante denies a Ukraine famine? He gets a personal invitation from Stalin for an interview. Nobody got that. Nobody, unless you were like one or two of the stooges, like the actual Western stooges. You could stay number one. When they do all this amazing reporting about Castro as Cuba's democratic savior, what happens in the wake of it? When Castro comes to New York for the first time as the now president ruler of Cuba, where does he go? To the New York Times to say thank you in person to the publisher and the reporter who did this work, Herbert Matthews. So doing this kind of thing does not damage them to the extent that it continually boosts their profile. You think like from a broad perspective where people just like not paying attention, what they see is like scoop by the New York Times, scoop by the New York Times, scoop by the New York Times. 1619 Project. I was in an airport the other day. What do I see? 1619 Project book. I don't see any other newspaper with a project book in the airport. I see that one. It doesn't matter that it's filled with half-truths, mistruths, lies, whatever, according, not to me, but to dozens of historians.
It's worth just, seeing as we're going to the 1690 Project, just for listeners who aren't familiar, if you wouldn't mind giving a quick roundup. I actually need refreshing on that particular one as well.
So the 1619 Project was, I believe it came out in August 2019. And I'm sort of flubbing on her name, Nicole Hannah-Jones, I believe. I might be like slightly getting it wrong, but she was a journalist of the New York Times Magazine. She'd done a lot of reporting about what she considered to be segregation in New York schools. Like she's making the claim that in like her child was going to a segregated school in New York. I don't know exactly how that works, or maybe it was in New York, but she's starting to rise, and she comes and pitches this project, 1619. 1619 was the year that slaves first arrived in the American colonies. The contention there is that America was founded not in liberty, as the traditional narrative goes, but in its exact opposite, slavery. And that almost every element of American society, culture, politics since then, including today, is a vestige of slavery, is tainted by slavery.
It's doubly provocative as a year because 1620 is the year the Mayflower landed, right? So It's trying to put it really right before you can say anything else happened apart from maybe Columbus.
Right. Prior to religious freedom,
right.
Prior to liberty, you have slavery. So, whether or not that belongs in a newspaper, to me, it doesn't strike me as something that does. It's an editorial decision. The problem with all this stuff is that to make this claim, she had to sort of concoct these facts that are just false. And this is where she ran into a lot of trouble. And so talking about the most distinguished scholars of American history and Black history and slave history come out saying this is just wrong, including in one really high-profile case where one of the New York Times' own fact checkers, a professor at Northwestern, said they had come to her about a specific fact related to, I think it might have been regarding whether or not the Revolutionary War was fought as a way to preserve slavery. And the fact checker, this professor, says, no, this is just wrong. You can't say it. They say it. They write, they print it anyway. And that's exactly what kept happening with the project. More and more and more of these claims are used to prop up this narrative because it's the narrative that mattered. And the facts, what's considered to be the objective truth, falls by the wayside. Incidentally, at the same time that the New York Times started to shift its notion of what journalism is away from objectivity. They started associating objectivity with white supremacy. And what you get is the 1619 Project, which is massively successful, massively. So this is where New York Times becomes the paradox of the New York Times. It's not just that you have a magazine issue in the New York Times, which is what it started as, a magazine issue, a whole issue. The entire New York Times Sunday magazine from that week was 1619 Project. It becomes the book, the children's book, the show that they're doing with Oprah, the curriculum that's going into schools around the United States and colleges. A full-blown cultural enterprise based in this thing that is supported by assertions that a vast array of historians and scholars say are not supportable.
Mm. So let's tie this all together then. We've looked at the mainstream media. We have looked at big tech. It seems to me that, and this is, I mentioned earlier, the theory about digital civil war that our mutual friend Biology has laid out, something that is going to be on this show. But, you describe Wikipedia, Google, obviously Google own YouTube. This show is on YouTube. And there's a sort of regime social media and New York Times, mainstream media and legacy media. And then there's the fight against it. There's the Elon Musk's, the Pavel Durovs.
Yes.
We've mentioned Julian Assange and others. And then you have Mark Zuckerberg, who seems to be flip-flopping between the two.
Yeah.
And is this pick a side time? How do I fit all this together? Is there sense in the madness? Is there sense in the chaos? How do you understand it, Ashley?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's like, it is really a maelstrom where you're kind of like, you feel like you're sort of plodding through the blizzard, of these countercurrents. I think we are absolutely at I wouldn't even say cultural, more almost like a civilizational crossroads. Like, where are we choosing? How are we choosing to operate as a society or as a group of societies? And I think what we're also seeing is we could say is X versus the platform versus Threads, right? The Meta platform. I think it's more the people who are living our lives versus the people with power and influence on the other side of it, mostly power. The people who are saying, I should probably be able to say what I want to say, and I should probably be able to go do my job without getting a vaccine passport, and I should probably not have to smuggle myself out of my own country as I did during COVID because I wasn't allowed to travel to the United States. I was living in Israel. That doesn't seem right to me. I think that's the primary, and it gets slapped with a label. That label is populism, and that label is tinged with all this political import about, you feel like you're breaking some kind of law by being populist. I don't think it's about populism. I think it's just about rights, and not just individual rights, because some of this gets cast as like a libertarian discussion, whereas the individual's rights, it's not about individual rights. It's about our rights as a citizenry, as a population together, versus the infringement of power, government, media, big business in a way. So the irony of social media is that even though it's been used as a tool for suppressing speech, it really is a place where we all can gather, because we couldn't all gather on the streets as we saw with COVID, and geographically we can't do that. Mm. But because the internet enables this kind of gathering, I think that's where the balance is shifting towards that position, where individuals and groups are gathering together. And a lot of the time, I find myself sort of allying with people on a given issue with whom I totally disagree on the next issue that is equally important to me. But that's okay, because I can say, all right, I think they're completely drastically wrong, offensively wrong on that other issue. But I'll put that aside. They can say what they want to say and think what they want to think, because it's important that we stick together on this issue. And that's what we're seeing, this crazy dynamic, which it's at the end of the day, it's impossible to track it. It's impossible, even with AI. And government, this is the next piece that I've got coming in Power Wires soon, a couple weeks, which is there are a lot of companies out there, startups, tech companies that are using AI to do this kind of monitoring because you can do it at scale really well. You can do like mass deletions very easily. You don't need people like sit in these channels and watch the channels. Even with that, I think the power that people have to talk, share, inquire, and interact is far greater than what any group of small, compacted, condensed coterie of power could do to us. So I think it's I think it's a bright future. I think right now we're kind of in that crisis mode where we do need to figure it out. And I think that you also, there's that Spider-Man thing of like great power and great responsibility. The truth is the great power resides with us as a population, as people on these platforms, but we also do have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to not, flagrantly offend, like you see some people on X doing or on other platforms doing because it gets clout, but to say, you know what, there is something to this idea that people should be treated equally, that you should accept other viewpoints. I mean, this is the whole point. You should accept other viewpoints. You should listen before we leap into some conclusion, some quip on X. I keep calling it Twitter. But it's a crisis. We're working through it. I think the future is bright. I love what biology is doing.
When you say the future is bright, do you mean that there's potential for a bright future because everyone has a voice now with, let's say, since Elon bought Twitter, now X? Or are you actually believe, no, that we're heading towards a bright future?
I think we're heading towards a bright future. I think we're in the bright future. I think we are.
This is the bright future.
In a way. I mean,
bloody hell.
When you people think about like this, the classic Joseph Campbell thing of the hero's journey, right? The hero's journey is never easy. And if it's easy, it's not heroic. But we are in the not easy part of the journey. You're only once you've like completed and like killed the monster and the monster rises up, you kill it again, and then okay, you're home. I don't know that that is mythical. It's always part of the struggle. You're always in the struggle, and we're continuing to struggle. And I think what happened in the late 90s and the early 2000s, where we're just like, oh, end of history, great. This like soporific, that was a worse place to be. It's way better to be awake and struggling than asleep and just like, buying stuff at the Gap, because that's what there is to do. So
asleep, and actually a lot of the problems today began because we were asleep, and nefarious actors snuck in while we weren't paying attention. So it's much better in that sense to be aware.
And you had what were your options in 1999, 2000, 2001 if you had something to say? You're going to write a letter to the editor at the Washington Post and pray that they'll print your like tiny little no, it's never going to happen. Today, whoever you are, could say, you know what, this issue is so important to me. I'm going to start a Substack. I'm going to invest a bit of my time every week. I'm going to build a following, and lo and behold, you've built something that matters and that has impact. And that's happening across the internet in such an incredible way.
Yeah. Ashley, we never on this show will rarely end in such optimistic terms. And I feel like that's a wonderful way to bring this conversation to a close. But if there's anything else you feel like, any loose ends you feel like you'd like to cover before the end, you feel good about it?
Yeah, I feel very good about it. I mean, I think this show itself, I mean, you were just telling me how you've gone independent and the show is doing amazing. I mean, is that not proof of what we're just talking about? Is that sometimes the more independent you go, the better it is, not just for the people who are consuming the content, but for you. And I think that's the lesson here. It's like, just plant your flag in the ground of independence. I mean, that's the lesson. And it does take courage. It does require risk, back to like what Jay Bhattacharya has done and is continuing to do. But I always think if you continue to embrace that notion that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, you internalize that, then our society gets better.
Amen to that. Ashley, where can audience, listeners, viewers find you? What's next for Ashley Rindsberg? Where can they find The Grey Lady Winked and your other work?
The Grey Lady Winked is on Amazon. It's
For now.
for for now. It is Grey with an A, not an E. I'm on Substack, ashleyrinsberg.substack.com. Doing this other stuff on Pirate Wires, which I highly recommend. It's really awesome. And on X, I'm out there, fighting the good fight. Yeah, causing trouble and getting some trouble too.
Great. Ashley Rindsberg, thank you so much.
Thank you, Winston.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. If you want to support the show, I ask that all you have to do is press subscribe. You press subscribe, we're going to have more wonderful guests like Ashley Rindsberg discussing the issues that you want to hear about. But for now, be well.